So, mobile first. What are the implications for tooling and so on? Should we think about it from a tooling perspective, or are you more interested in the social aspects?
I'll answer both of those issues.
Thank you.
Sure. On the social aspects, one of the things that comes to mind is that, in a way, we in the enterprise space and the commercial space are recreating the same kinds of things that happened on the battlefield, even a decade or so ago. If you look at DARPA's strategic computing program from the, 80s, 90s or so, there was this concept of the battlefield that basically every soldier would be in some way wired to this network on the battlefield, so you could know exactly where you were, and you'd have the ability to look into surveillance from the sky and all that. You had a complete picture of it. The problem, of course, is that the DoD had to create its own infrastructure, and a lot of that fell apart because that infrastructure was so expensive. And on the battlefield, you're dealing with noisy conditions. So in a way, we sort of have already been there with regards to the kinds of architectural issues that one must attend to for these kinds of pervasive mobile things. And now that we have the infrastructure in the commercial space, we have this incredibly rich primordial soup of standards and platforms and services that makes it possible to do amazing things like this taxi service. I think that by and large, we're largely limited by our imagination. It's not the technology that's holding most people back, but it's our imagination of the possible. That's difficult for many entrenched enterprise companies because, not to say they lack imagination, but they tend to be very conservative. And thus the first step I'll often see people do is produce this crunchy outer shell on their enterprise and declare it mobile and declare victory. And as we've all agreed, that's simply not enough. It does require a transformative way of looking at your business. So the first step is I can talk about tools all day, but until the company, the organization really understands that they must transform the way they engage with their customers, the best tools are not going to necessarily help them. There are tools we can deal with. I think that and IBM and others are providing those kinds of things. But the first step is we have to get over the boundary of it's not just, as Tim said, not just a small screen. It's a different way of engaging with the world.
But the tools, to me, perhaps, given as a developer on conference, developers do like implementation details. So I don't want to go too hard on this because obviously you're both abstract thinkers. But you tend to be quite specific as well. Are there some technologies in mobile that are helping to underpin, or in fact, I guess in data and implicitcy, is that a word? Implicitness? What are the tools and methods we should be looking at if we want to start building these kinds of experiences?
I think right now, you've got platform-specific interfaces, and that's a bit of a problem. Here's Apple's location framework for the iPhone, and here's the Android location framework, and so on. And we do need, I think, an abstraction layer so that it will be easier to build, data access apps.
You just made a lot of people at IBM very happy. They love nothing better than hearing about an abstraction layer.
Well, if you think about years ago, I actually, to your quip about, I'm 8 years ahead. I will remind everyone that someone famously said that being too early is indistinguishable from being wrong. And back in 2001, when I did a conference with the subtitle "Building the Internet Operating System," everybody kind of made fun of it. In fact, at the first Web 2.0 conference, which came 4 years later, which was kind of picking up on the theme, Bram Cohen of BitTorrent, who you'd think would think otherwise, his talk was making fun of the idea that the internet was an operating system. And yet you look at our mobile apps today and what is the operating system? It certainly isn't what's on the device. And the notion that I've had, and I think we're starting to see the fulfillment of, but have not yet formalized, is that access to certain kinds of data sources, are really the subsystems of that internet operating system. So everybody's at war in some sense, trying to say, well, no, I have the identity subsystem. So you see, log in with Facebook, log in with Google, log in with Twitter, or it's like use my location sensor, my location layer, and the question is whether one company will end up dominating this, layer, or whether there'll be, the equivalent of an open source internet operating system where we say, okay, because it isn't just software, it is software plus data. In some cases, it's software plus data plus access to devices. Now, some of those things are, in fact, open standards. The fact that we have access to GPS, but everybody's built their own database of, Wi-Fi. There's some public ones, but it's not really standardized. And I think that's going to be one of the interesting challenges, because as we have more devices, more form factors, somebody could build something that's open and ubiquitous, and will make it easier for developers to do the right thing. Because I do think a lot of the apps are still in the transitional phase. I know they've fixed it since then, but I used to rag on Runkeeper, which is one of my investments. I said, why do I have to tell the app that I started running and that I finished? Doesn't the app already know that? And it's just, they've done that now. But in the beginning, and some of it, of course, also has to do with power, and this sort of physical limits of the devices. But if you kind of extrapolate out a few years, you have to imagine, first of all, there's way more data. That data has become not just more ubiquitous, but starts to be much better structured. We actually have enough identity data that people are identifiable. We've gotten over some of the issues, that, right now, it would be possible for me right now, barring the fact that Google won't touch this with a 10-foot pole because they're, afraid of all the privacy backlash, for me to be looking at this audience in Google Glass and having your names pop up for probably half the people in the room, And, I'll tell you, as somebody who meets a lot of people, talk about the creepy to magical continuum. Right now, boy, a lot of people say that's creepy, but I'll tell you, the number of people who come up to me and assume that I remember their name, and again, there are people like Bill Clinton who remember everybody they've ever met, oh yeah, we met 4 years ago, I'm sorry, that's not me. I may have. I will. No,
go ahead. Sorry.
I will say this: how many people have seen The Princess Bride? Doesn't he look a bit like the six-fingered man? So there are false positives.
So there's a kind of a weird, the idea of always, not remembering everybody's name, but knowing everybody's name.
Yeah.
That's a profound, and I guess we will become worse at remembering people's names because in the same way...
Maybe, it's certainly possible. The other thing, you could also think about, what are the social norms around that kind of world? It could be, I'll only show you the names of people you already know. Who you met, and give you context. Go, oh yeah, yes, this is somebody who you met with, like 2 years from now. Will I remember who I met here at IBM Impact? It would be great to have that reminder. And would it be privacy invading? Would it be creepy if, it recognized somebody who I met here? No, they would be incredibly grateful that I remembered their name.
What about you guys? Creepy or magic? Creepy or magic? Creepy.
No.
Magic?
Magic.
Yeah.
It's on a continuum. Good. Invest in that. I guess, and that was funny because you try and get specific, and it's not that Tim is trying to evade that the question, but quite frankly, one of the things that strikes me is mobile first means cloud first means social first. These things are all coming together.
That's
all
right.
of these trends at the moment, the primordial soup that Grady talks about. As an analyst, this stuff is hard to unpack.
I'd add that what we're experiencing is this trying to fit things together. It's not unlike what happened in the earliest days of email on the internet, where there were competing islands and they didn't play well with one another. And time was on its side, and we found ways that now a guy can go from an AOL address to any place else in the world, but it used to be those kind of islands.
Oh yeah, actually, if you're really old like us, you probably remember a book that O'Reilly published in, I think, 1994 called, I can't even remember the exact order, I think it was bang, at, splat, whatever. There's 4 or 5 different characters that we use as email separators, a directory of email addressing and networks. And its basic goal, it listed something like 150 different email networks. And this is the magic gateway. If you address your email to this site, it will translate it so you can get from BitNet to ARPANET, or you can get from UCP to DECnet. Here's how you do it.
And we're in a similar space now that you have all these competing things. Time and economics has its way of plastering over them. And we'll eventually see some dominant design emerge. I think in the marketplace will.
And don't you think that's a little bit of an analogy? They talk about junk DNA. And well, what is it? It's actually all these. It's actually all the cruft. Nobody ever refactored DNA. And the fact is, it's just all layered in there. Things that some of which kind of work still, and
someday an alien civilization will come across the device and they'll find dots at the bottom of it.
That's right.
I mean, I think for this audience, it's probably also interesting because sometimes those things that are declared wrong paths, it turns out are quite useful. There was a talk earlier, and it was interesting because it was from GBS, and they were like, "Oh, Java isn't the only language. You need to look at these other languages that are being used on the web." What is interesting to me is what we're seeing is a lot of those web companies that set themselves up in opposition to Java, are now using it. So if we look at Hadoop, Facebook jettisoned its own technology in favor of Hadoop, and now they're one of the biggest Java shops in the world. If you look at Twitter, they say that the only reason they could stand up the load during the U.S. election was because of the JVM. And again, I think that biological thing, or that notion of junk DNA, sometimes it's not junk.
It's a survival of the fittest. And again, the marketplace ultimately decides.
What about tooling? And can you're a fellow now, so in a sense at IBM you're not driving rational strategy.
I'm not.
And in fact you're probably not even building rational tools.
I am not.
What do you think of this is a tough question. I want to ask about rational. What are some interesting tools that you may have looked at for building some of these kinds of apps recently?
I'll be honest in telling you I haven't looked at many because I am personally not building such apps. What I do find is there are a lot of apps that codify things we know how to do easily on the mobile space. If I want to, actually it's back to the green screen days. That we're seeing the same kinds of tools now that allowed you back in the early mainframe days to take what you had as a green screen app and then move it to some other monitor. We're seeing the same kinds of tools now that do the easy stuff, the low-hanging fruit, and that's where a lot of the tools are at the moment. What I've not seen are the transformative tools that allow you to look at the architecture of these things where mobile is just one subsystem in it, and I have all these competing services that I can now mix and match. We're not there yet. I think that's a great tool opportunity.
Yeah, I do think that there's a really interesting notion. You mentioned, Java. If you go back to the early days of Java, a lot of the vision of Java was Internet of Things driven.
Wasn't there Fridge?
Well,
it was originally.
Yeah, there were all kinds of ideas.
Focus for that.
Internet Fridge.
Yeah.
This is bad news. I'm gonna.
Have you noticed that these are
sneeze?
He's going to take a photograph.
No, I'm going to sneeze. I think I held it off. Good. But the thing that's sort of interesting there, going back, I remember something that one of my coworkers, Nat Torkington, once said. He said every new successful web app was once a Unix utility. And and it's really it was sort of interesting. You look at it and you go, that's going to get re-implemented. That's going to get re-implemented and just rebuilt for the web. And I think we will see a reinvention of many old tools. So digital archaeology is actually worthwhile, to go back and look at old ideas and say, oh, wait, we could actually do that now. Oh, we could do that in a way that really works. Oh, so don't just listen to the futurists, listen to the historians.
And even in the mobile space, we're still bound
that was a setup, Grady.
Okay.
We're computing the experience.
I'll get to that. Yeah. But on the mobile side, too, we're still replicating a lot of the gestures that we've seen elsewhere. And we've moved the gestures that you find from the laptop a little bit to the screen itself. I think we're only beginning to explore the right way to interact with these devices. And one way to interact with them is actually not to touch them. And we're only beginning to understand that. I don't want to have to pick
I mean,
up my
Colossus is definitely a halfway house, right? Not even a halfway house.
totally.
It's going to be the implant very soon.
Yeah, I think that's fair. The other thing I think that's really worth understanding is where the intelligences can move around. We, in this very, very personal era of the phone, it's very easy to think of the intelligence being in the device that's your personal device, but there's no reason why it couldn't be somewhere else. So, for example, the Nest, home thermostat is, paying attention via sensors. And it's not like you're sitting there controlling it with your app. It's controlling itself based on its own observations of the world around it. And I can easily, or something like the Kinect. The Kinect is observing you. You aren't controlling it. Pay no attention to the woman behind the...
Nothing to see here, folks.
Move along now.
We'll get it when we need it.
So,
Yeah.
from Nest back to the history of computing, how do I do that bridge?
Well, it's not so much the history we're trying to attend to. The premise we have, let me step back. About 5 years ago, I came at this sort of cusp in my personal life saying, I've done some interesting things, but what's next? And I've come to the realization that...
Is that before or after you moved to Hawaii?
Yes. We were in the process of moving to Hawaii around that time. And came to the realization there is I live in a geek world, and I circulate among geeks such as you, but most of the world doesn't understand what we do. There's a great quote by Carl Sagan that says, we rely so much upon science and technology, and yet most of the world does not understand science and technology. To reframe it, we could say, we live in a world exquisitely dependent upon computing, and yet most of the world does not understand computing. We have a goddaughter. She was a tween at the time, going on 30, I think. And we told her we had this idea, and she said, oh, I know everything there is to know about computing because I've taken a class. Really? What class have you taken? And what did you learn? Oh, we learned how to write a Word document and to log in on the web. Clearly, she knows everything. So the reality of computing is that it has moved more and more to the interstitial spaces of our world. And as we as a society are slowly surrendering to it little by little, we'd like to step back and say, wait a minute, let's be intentional about this. And so our intent is the journey we've been on to develop a documentary for public television to explore that in the ways that computing has interacted with the human experience, how it has changed us and how we've changed computing. That's the journey we're on.
Yeah. Just on that thread, there's so many opportunities. And one of the things I'm interested in that you guys know a lot more about than I do, I think because of the world you live in, is how this is going to affect the enterprise. I remember back, I created a stir a few years back when I said, people should really start thinking about Walmart as a Web 2.0 company. And they said, what the devil is he talking about? But for me, Web 2.0 was about how do you build a digital nervous system where you gain intelligence from all of your users, and a system in which when somebody checks out, using a scanner and triggers a reorder from the manufacturer into the supply chain, that's just as Web 2.0 as somebody doing collective intelligence and recommendations on a website. Because it wasn't about, this is about the web. It was like, no, it's about how do you use data to make a system that's smarter, that's more autonomous. And, this is going to, completely affect the enterprise. It's completely going to affect, industrial systems. GE's talking about the industrial internet, IBM talking about smart cities. You guys are Smart Planet. This is the wave of the future, where we take this technology or these ideas that we're now kind of getting a little bit more comfortable with on the consumer end, and how they're realized in the big systems that really control our world. Smarter logistics with less waste, an energy grid that is responsive to demand. Even social systems. At Code for America, one of the projects I'm most excited that we're working on.
What do you say a bit about what Code for America
Oh, okay.
is?
Sorry, I should do that. Yeah, Code for America is a nonprofit. It's about 3 years old. It started out as a service year program to get technologists to come work with cities for a year. Signed a team of three or four fellows to go work with the city on a project area of interest. They do a lot of small apps, but there's usually a big focus. The cities actually apply as well. This year we're working with 9 different cities.
Oh, by the way, hint folks, Tim would like IBM to be more involved with this organization. So if any of you there could help a little bit.
Yes, there's a variety of ways that people can help. We also have, at this point, an accelerator program for civic startups. We have also, they started work on an international program. I'm on the board and fairly involved with the program. But back to what I was saying, one of the really exciting projects we're working on this year with New York City and with Louisville, Kentucky, is in the area of criminal justice. It turns out that, just to give you background, when somebody is picked up by the police accused of a crime, we have a constitutional right in the U.S. to a speedy trial. Well, you don't get one anymore. There's this huge backlog. People are often held in jail for 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks before they have a trial, sometimes longer. And what's more, it turns out that if you're held in jail rather than released on your own recognizance or on bail, you're much more likely to be convicted. Because you come in, you're a convict. You come in prison clothes, whereas if you're released, you come in, you're wearing your suit, you're on your best behavior, they go, this guy looks like a reasonable, upstanding citizen, and, you get, the odds are really different. Not only that, it's one of the largest costs to cities, because it's actually, regardless of what level of crime you're accused of, you're actually held by the city until your trial. And so, turns out there's a group called the Arnold Foundation that's built a predictive analytics model about who you can let out safely. And so we're working with these cities to actually gather the data and build an app for judges to let them kind of figure out should they let this person out on bail or not.
Didn't I read about that in Minority Report?
That's pre-crime.
Okay.
They would have picked you up long ago.
No, absolutely.
IBM has built that up.
But the point is, this is the kind of system of getting into the workflow of our society and thinking about how we can use technology to, solve big social problems. I think there's so much opportunity. And, one of the things that I love to encourage people to think about, and particularly, I've been doing a lot of activism about open government over the last couple of years because this is crisis. Everybody's upset that we're paying so much for government services. And in the area of IT, you see enough to be outraged. But the answer isn't to say, let's cut government to the bone, let's stop providing these services. It's like, no, let's get cost efficient, because I think both the right and the left are correct. The right says government's too big, costs too much. The left says, no, we're not getting enough services to our citizens. We're not doing all the things we need to do. But the answer isn't just to give more money, it's to actually do things smarter and spend that $100 million that they spend $100 million on a website. I mean, this is crazy. So spend $1 million or spend $50,000 on a website and spend that $100 million on something hard. It's kind of crazy when Clay Johnson, who's a friend of mine, wrote a blog post recently about, there was a big to-do about the $100 million for mapping the human brain. Hey, guess what? This particular website, which doesn't work pretty well, costs $130 million, so what's the big deal? So we got to fix that. We got to have more money for the things that are hard and important, and less money spent on things that are now easy.
So cities are going through this process of re-envisioning themselves, and that's really difficult, just as enterprises do. I mean, cities have a more difficult time than enterprises do to re-envision themselves, because within cities you've got all these competing political groups that have already, over the years, defined the lines of demarcation among them. So it's curious that we're seeing the emergence of new cities around the world, because they're not dealing with the legacy of the old cities. We see it in China and elsewhere, where they say, we're just going to start afresh and build these things. Will they succeed? I don't know, because very few cities have been built that way. But we shall see. But it's a representation that taking an existing city and refactoring it is really, really hard.
Well, London is a great example. I mean, the roads are very narrow.
Very medieval.
They're certainly not amenable to cars and cyclists.
And yet you are the city that has the most surveillance cameras per capita.
Yes.
Has that made a difference?
No. Well, I don't know. We've made a difference to what?
True.
It turns out that a lot of those cameras, they ended up just like turning them off. So the camera is there, it isn't necessarily doing anything. We have led this world into a surveillance society, but it doesn't actually, on the creepy magic continuum, it worried me a lot, but on a day-to-day basis, it doesn't. And I have to say that when the 7/7 bombings happen, suddenly you do find that you're, being able to use that footage to unpack stuff and work out, or the recent bombings in Boston. Boston is going to be if you think London has a lot of cameras, Boston will soon, I think, compete.
Right.
Because, the people's need and for a feeling of safety, whether or not that truly gives it them, I think is...
I'm all for smarter cities. I'm just concerned about some of the stupid people that govern them, and I don't know how to attend to them.
Yes, there are many of those. There is some hope, though. I think that in terms of how much a website costs...
Notice I said some of the people. I didn't say all the people that govern them.
There is a very interesting organization that you might look at. Within your organization, say you're a software developer and you feel that as a practitioner that you're perhaps not being listened to. That's a tough problem, and it's useful to have some things to point at to say, hey, look, that actually there are some organizations that are changing and becoming more effective because they are working with practitioners. I think the UK government at the moment is doing something very interesting because, to Tim's point, the Cabinet Office, when the current coalition came in, they looked at the expenditure on static web publishing, and it was £200 million a year on static web publishing. Basically the way that services were provisioned to the citizen, you had the civil service saying in fact you had the politicians saying we need these policy changes. The civil service would then say, okay, we will implement them, and they would decide which ones they would actually do and kind of ignore the politicians. I'm sure some of you have seen Yes Minister. But you had basically civil servants and outsourcing companies, and that was it. There were no one within the civil service that knew anything about IT. And so the government is now rebuilding a practitioner organization. It's called the Government Digital Service. It's grown very quickly. It's now 200 people. One of the things they had to do to put the pressure back on the suppliers, although they were not originally intending to, was to start building websites and building services. So they've been using all of the sort of modern tooling we might expect. They have been using GitHub. They're posting everything as open source. They're developing in Rails. In fact, they're really pushing the envelope. If there's an interesting programming environment that Google has built called Go, they're very quickly moving to using that. And so they're building these very interesting services. They just won an award for the design of gov.uk. And when you start to get government organizations kind of winning awards for their design, something is afoot.
Yeah, let me just add something here. There's a document called the UK government the GDS Design Principles, which is one of, I think, the most important design documents for computer applications in a long time. I don't know how many of you would remember the original Macintosh user interface design principles. That was sort of this revolutionary idea that a company would say, okay, we're going to tell you how to design your apps. And the GDS design principles is the first document that will totally transform not just government apps, but any kind of enterprise apps. It just has principles like start with user aids, but it walks it through in a beautiful, simple, clear way of how you do decision making and about what's important.
So if you are building apps, it's worth looking at these guidelines. And if you're trying to get the organization that you work for to understand that it shouldn't just be a purchasing decision, that the line of businesses want something and then we can buy it from a vendor. These are the kinds of organizations it's worth pointing to.
IBM's going through the same process right now. We have too many products, to be very honest. Our portfolio is enormous, such that any of our sales folks can only understand bits of them, and our customers can only understand bits of them as well. So this is why they've established Phil Gilbert as VP of Design. So to have such a person, and for us to spend the money on that, I think is very cool, because it's a representation that IBM knows we have to refactor our portfolio and bring concepts of design into it. So we're trying to eat our own dog food.
Well, he talks about this very nicely. He spoke at an event I ran, and one of the strong points he made, and it gets back to this mobile first kind of idea, and in that you may think that what you're actually doing is something about mobile. Mm-hmm. So when he was told, oh, you need to redesign products, the immediate thing is, well, how do we make them look pretty? But for him, it was a much more fundamental decision of if you have 40 or 50 products in the portfolio, how do we boil that down into 4? And that's sort of a fundamental design decision. It's not about the external way it looks. It's about actually making those tough decisions.
Right. And it is an architectural issue. So I do spend less time on the tools and more on the architecture side, because a lot of what you're talking about represents the codification of design patterns that represent the major design decisions of a system. We know how to architect a large class of systems, but the technology of mobile first has upset things because we don't really have the design patterns yet that tell us here's the best practices for these things. So the marketplace is deciding that. We'll eventually get those. We'll get there sometime.
By the way, I told you I'd look up this Steve Jobs quote.
Yes.
He said design, a lot of people think of design as a kind of interior decorating. And he said design is the fundamental soul of a man-made creation that ends up expressing itself in successive outer layers of the product or service.
Right.
And I think that's really,
Yeah.
and so design and architecture really go hand in hand.
Absolutely.
And, when we talk about open source and when we talk about beautiful products, we're really talking about beautiful architecture.
And open source evolves to that beauty because you have many eyes that are contributing to it, and is a built-in process that open source must be used fanatically in the marketplace, such there is great pressure to refactor it and get it right over time so that it fits.
But there's some open source projects. I remember giving this advice to various projects early on. Just like you're not really going to succeed because your architecture doesn't support an open source process.
Right.
When Sun was looking at first open sourcing what became Open Office, I said I think unless you refactor, it's going to be a lot harder.
Absolutely.
And because it was just a big pile of spaghetti code.
It still has not.
Yeah, and it hasn't really built that community because it's hard for people to participate, not because of the license, but because of the architecture. Versus, Apache, or I think what's happening with OpenStack.
Yeah.
Just really well architected for people to, do a stone soup kind of thing. Bring your own interest to the party, build something, and it just fits together.
I'd like to ask you something. I've been wondering about something I've been noticing with younger developers, and we've had FOSS, free and open source software. To me, it's like we're moving to now POS, which is post open source software. It seems like a lot of younger developers don't think it matters. They just go to GitHub and they put the code up. What are the implications of that? And do you think is that okay? Is that a good thing? Is that, we've moved towards more permissive licenses, but now it's almost like, well, the license doesn't matter. Should that make us?
You're probably asking the wrong person because I made the assertion many, many years ago, probably, first started talking about this in maybe 1999, that I thought open source licenses didn't matter. And I don't think they don't matter at all. I mean, there clearly are cases where the license is a powerful weapon. But what I saw as far back as 99 was that as we moved to the world of cloud, just having the software didn't give you very much. I remember I literally had this debate with Richard Stallman at this conference in Berlin in 99, and I said, look, if I was on the board at the time of Nutch, which was an open source search engine project that had been started by Doug Cutting, who was the creator of Hadoop. And, he'd just been talking about how it was sort of a research project, but they really couldn't get to the scale of data, that would really require for people to use it very, very effectively. Because, it costs money. There were business processes, and so I said to Richard, if you had all Google source code, you wouldn't have Google because it's business processes, it's data, it's people. The whole world of software is changing in the era of the cloud. And his response at that time, he later came around and realized he was wrong, I think. Well, I don't know if he'd admit it that way. He said, it doesn't matter because Google isn't running on my machine. Which kind of indicates how it's really important to think about the shape of the future. Because I think there was a missed opportunity back in 1999 for the open source community to think about where the world was going, to think about what the implications of the web were, to stop thinking about, oh, we're going to have Linux replace Windows, and we'll have this open world on the PC, but instead to sort of see, okay, well, let's actually think about the internet, think about how open source works there, think about what's starting to happen with companies like Google accumulating massive amounts of data. We could have thought a lot more about open data back then. We could have thought a lot more about what are the subsystems of this future internet operating system.
Tim infuriated me with this. This is one of the reasons I asked him, in fact. I remember at the time, and he described it very well. He said, well, data is the new Intel Inside. And to me, I was like, great, something that somebody else is going to own. It may create value, but certainly it's going to be a lock for somebody. But yeah, I remember that.
But my point was, if you realize that, then if you really care about openness, you're going to stop worrying so much about what the license is on the software, and you're going to figure out what are the other choke points. So much of my thinking actually was informed by the experience of IBM with the personal computer. The fact is, IBM created this thing which became, by accident, led to the commoditization of hardware and the wonderful expansion of the computer market that we know today. But it destroyed IBM's old monopoly, and because nobody really understood the implications, everybody was fighting over, we're going to try to somehow put the genie back in the bottle with proprietary hardware. Rather than going to commodity hardware. Meanwhile, Microsoft kind of walked in and realized it was a new choke point, and they owned it. And I said, this is going to happen again. The internet and open source software are going to, commoditize a lot of what we've thought of as the choke points of software in operating systems. And what's going to happen? Somebody's going to figure out a new choke point. Clay Christensen, of Innovator's Dilemma fame, called it the law of conservation of attractive profits. When something becomes commoditized, something else becomes valuable. And I became convinced pretty early on that it was going to be, data of various kinds. Now, I think there are other choke points, but it is something to think about in as you look at the future and you see these new technologies, becoming ubiquitous. They may commoditize one current source of value. But it's fairly inevitable that something else will become valuable. And so what you have to start thinking about is, what is that going to be?
Well, there's clear issues of just ownership over data. There will be islands where enterprises can legitimately say, I own this data and its creation. But there are other places where it gets very, very messy. And it reminds me of the debates going on about the ownership of genes. Are these things that are patentable? Is it possible for some agency out there to patent a sequence that I have? Look at what's happening with telematics in cars. Who owns that data? And I think the social challenge is that data is out there being generated by us individually, and yet it is being used in ways beyond our choice. And
I think that those are absolutely the issues we should be asking about today. And the thing that companies need to realize too is, and I think Google, to their credit, recognizes this pretty well, there are some natural monopolies in data. Google says, sure, we have our data liberation front. Anytime you want to extract your data from Google, we'll make it easy. People like Apple, Amazon, and so on, don't make it as easy as Google does. Well, why is that? Because Google knows that your individual little piece of data isn't that valuable, because it's valuable in the context of all the other data that they have. And so I think, again, that's part of it is I think there's a kind of opportunity to figure out, where you can be generous with data because you've actually figured out where the leverage actually is, because you've actually got some other pieces that make it more valuable. So that's the same reason, why you don't put your money under your mattress, because it's actually less valuable when you keep it there.
Well, one of the episodes we're contemplating for our project, computingthehumanexperience.com, if you want to go take a peek at it.
Is this with hyphens or?
No hyphens, it's all bashed together. Computing the human experience, no spaces, obviously. Is the notion of community and isolation. Sherry Turkle, raises these wonderful issues about how our sense of privacy is utterly changing. I've come to the conclusion that maybe what's happened over at least my generation is the aberration. Because if you consider life in medieval times, in small cities and tribes, there was a very different sense of privacy. You always knew what was going on. You knew if somebody different was coming in. You knew the sense of connections. And it has been modern urban life that's changed that. In some ways, the web's bringing us back to those kinds of tribes. And we're pushing back against it because we've grown up expecting those kinds of bits of privacy. But for most of human evolution, we never really had that kind of privacy.
Back to the continuum.
Back to the continuum, yes. That'd
Yes,
be a great
we
name for a science fiction show.
There you go. We were all sharing a cave together,
Absolutely.
and there wasn't a lot of
And then when
privacy.
we reach the notion of consciousness in the web itself, as Tim is suggesting we may achieve someday, there is no privacy.
So this being an unconference, we really should be involving you as a
Are there
community.
people out there? Oh, there are people out there.
And I know
I'm
we've
just having a
got
fun
quite
time.
a lot of time. Sometimes you kind of with these things, questions are the afterthought. But I think it's very important that we involve and hopefully engage you. If there aren't any questions, you know that we can ramble on all day. But I'd be interested in terms of some of the things we've been talking about, and perhaps the issues that you face, whether you've got any questions for these guys. I'm not seeing a lot of okay, sorry, go ahead, Tim, before
No,
we...
go ahead. I was just going to put out another concept, but I can do that after this question.
So it strikes, do we have a mic that we can, maybe I will walk around, because it strikes me that we should also keep the internet involved.
Is there another mic on the table there?
Yes, there is a mic on the table.
All right. Good. While we're waiting there, why don't I just throw out one other idea that I think is a framing concept. We were talking about intelligence in the web, and I look for big ideas that are lenses through which I can see the world. And one that's really caught my attention lately was actually a paper by J.C.R. Licklider from 1960 called Man-Machine Symbiosis. The notion that humans and computers together can do things that neither can do alone. And it's another frame with which you can look at applications like Uber, which we were talking about earlier, but also in remarkable ways, things that look like advances in artificial intelligence are actually advances in man-machine symbiosis. For example, the Google driverless car is remembering the routes driven by human Google Street View drivers who are augmented with sensors and storing their memory in the global brain. That gives you kind of a design pattern for thinking about certain kinds of applications. How do you actually have a computer remember what a human did and then learn from it? Robotic surgery works the same way. The robot watches the humans do it and says, oh, I know what they're doing now. I can do that more precisely.
I prefer to call it augmented intelligence.
That's right. So
And
it's
intelligence.
it's intelligence augmentation.
And I celebrate that notion because it's very different than Ray as well,
Yeah.
Ray Kurzweil, because Ray, I think, takes, I'll be very frank in saying, a very selfish view of the technology and the notion of the singularity, because he's focused upon what it does to the individual. I think what you and I are saying is there's really something transformative socially, that
That's
we're
right.
connecting with the world very differently, and
Yeah.
that's fundamentally different.
There we go. We're ready for questions.
My name is Ivan Portillo with GBS, and I want to ask you about innovation. Usually innovation has been driven here in this country, the internet, the smartphone, but now with globalization, we're starting to see these ideas coming from other cultures. Do you see that as a trend?
To reframe your question, it's basically, are we seeing innovation in other... Impacted by globalization. Got it.
I would say absolutely yes, and I would remind you of the old joke about which goes something like this. What do you call somebody who speaks one language? Oh, sorry. Actually, I got it backwards. What do you speak somebody who speaks three languages? Well, they're trilingual. Two languages. They're bilingual. What do you call somebody who speaks one language?
American.
Yeah. Right. I think our perspective on global innovation, here in the U.S. is probably the worst in the world because we're so full of ourselves. I think yes, there is innovation all over the world, and we could be learning a lot more from it. And certainly some things sort of break out and come into our consciousness. You think about Skype from Estonia and so on. But I think there's a lot more of that. and that we're going to see over the next decade, just huge changes, just blindsiding companies that are too insular.
So to me, I think this is just a great example. This is a phone that runs Android, which is pretty much a West Coast phenomenon. But Samsung, are just doing a tremendous, amazing job of manufacturing and supply chain in order to make these devices. And I think one of the interesting things from a global innovation perspective is looking at adoption patterns of technology. So if you're in, California right now, you still think that Apple iPhone is the only device. However, if you're in Europe, you've seen a very rapid adoption of Android, certainly, and it was when I began to see European developers that were beginning to select Android first, I knew something was really afoot. And I think that difference in adoption patterns is something that certainly the West Coast would be, they should probably think about that, because there is a bit of a bubble there. And, I think that Android is winning, frankly, and the rest of the world is, or should I say the West Coast will shortly catch up. Tim may have a different view. I don't know if you...
I wanted to add that it's a testament to IBM, I think, that we've established a laboratory in Africa and one in Brazil, which is a recognition that IBM understands there are some really bright minds out there. We want to tap into that. I think we in the U.S., we are way too complacent. Just look on the mobile side, as you say. There are many places around the world, Korea in particular, where I go about. And the use of the cellular network there is so fundamentally different than it is here. And we think we know it all. No, I think we're going to be blindsided.
Yeah, no, it's really funny because you hear, I forget who was telling me this story. It was Gavin Newsom. Was telling about, he was bragging about some new innovations, that they were putting in place in San Francisco when he was mayor. And, my gosh, we're tracking our buses, we're doing such and such. And this guy from Eastern Europe was like, what? We've been doing that for half dozen years.
Right. Again, the British government...
Why is this exciting?
One of the things the British government has been doing as it reconsiders its IT infrastructure that I was talking about is learning from people that are doing it more effectively. And the way they did that is they went to Africa and sort of looked and said, wait, they're all using Gmail. Maybe something's afoot. And I think that, again, learning lessons, certainly in Africa, there is a ton of really interesting innovation because, constraints drive innovation.
That's right. Where's there a functioning open medical record system? Oh, guess what? In Kenya.
Use the phrase, one of you used the phrase that there's just enough computing power on the edge for many of those devices.
That would have been him.
Okay.
I think I have a question. It's from me.
Oh.
Quick question. So, anyone else raise your hand, but I'm going to ask a quick question on the man-machine interface. I want to flip it around. Yeah. Google Glass is a great example of sort of the man-machine interface, but the machine-man interface. I've been obsessed with thinking about what should we do with Watson at IBM, because I think it's a great machine-man interface, right? So what would you do if you could, any of you, if you could put Watson in the hands of the everyday person, right? What if you could put Watson on your Android, or what if you could open that world up, right? What are your thoughts there?
It absolutely has to happen. I was talking to a Dutch guy from IBM just this morning about this. As soon as I saw Watson, I knew that, and it was very interesting because the IBM had taken there was an interesting, again, talking about design constraints, is that it needed to be done in the room. So they'd architected it to be a system not connected to the internet. So they would, take the data sets and put them in the machine, but it was specifically architected to not be a web architecture in a sense.
Yeah, I'll add on that I know Susanna Fox, who's a well-known healthcare patient advocate, is dismayed that Watson is not more open, to the sort of the health community. So it's sort of very much sort of this idea of, well, it's a for physicians, and so I think making that Watson technology much more available, for experimentation. I think one of the things that the internet is really good at is innovation, and I would love to see Watson less as an application and more as a platform.
I think Watson is the new ThinkPad. IBM needs to be in the hands of the consumer. IBM has taken this, we don't do consumer, we'll let someone else do that. Watson is for everyone.
In Watson's defense, a considerable amount of Watson's architecture is open source. The fundamental pipe and structure architecture, filter architecture of Watson is UEMA, which is available freely for anyone. The innovation I think that Watson really did is that we now understand an architecture that allows us to deal with information that is ambiguous and self-contradictory. Right. But we know how to do that once. And the challenge is, how do you do that again? So that's where
and maybe it was really just not in at that stage.
Yeah, tell her, be a little patient,
And then for me, I think it's going to happen. Apparently, there was even a session here that mobile Watson is close to fruition. I mean, it's interesting to me, we've got Google Now, we've got Apple Siri, we've got Facebook Home, and I think we will be having Watson as part of the infrastructure. To me, I think what's really profound and why I think IBM should be thinking about putting it in more people's hands is that Google effect, that architecture of participation and learning. Because if IBM knows the questions that everybody on the planet needs answering, that is profoundly transformative. And so for me, there's actually, and IBM's beginning to get it. They've done some wonderful marketing. I noticed you might like this phrase. One of the ads, it says, mobile is not a device, it's data. And I think that's really important. I'm still talking to people that are thinking about this as a way of expressing data. This is actually a way of collecting data into the cloud and doing interesting things. So I think really it's a matter of time.
But let me just add in one other thing about sort of Watson as man-machine symbiosis. You know, it is in fact, if you look at all the levels, first of all, what is Watson's source of data? It's a bunch of research, or, like in the case of the medical application, it's reading all the research papers. Yes. It's an augmented, it's part of a system that includes humans. No scientific research papers for Watson to read, no recommendations from Watson. So that's kind of one of the key design patterns. We're building systems that we are part of, and then the question is, okay, how do we actually get the optimal participation in those systems? So for example, you can imagine, a world with open access is better for Watson than a world where, scientific research is behind paywalls. Now, the people who currently are offering scientific research with very, very expensive subscriptions to libraries are going to fight that. But we look at the future, and if I'm a policymaker, do I want to bet on the past or on the future? I want Watson to be able to read frickin' everything. Yeah. I don't want to have to say, sorry, Watson, you can't read that stuff because IBM doesn't want to pay Elsevier.
See, there you go. I was
they had to remove
in this session. and it's kind of funny.
What did I say?
Damn right.
No. I think I may have actually been compliant, which is quite unusual. But now that there's
they did have to remove the Urban Dictionary because Watson got kind of an attitude.
Yes, Watson had
So that was clearly a great question. We're animated. I'm talking too much.
We have another question.
Jeffrey, what's your question, sir?
All right, I'm going to start this with Grady, but the other two, feel free to jump in. Grady, you've talked about architecture and doghouses versus skyscrapers in the past, and through our shared experience, we've looked at software as an engineering profession, but I've been struggling lately because I feel like we've over-rotated on that a lot, and a lot of the innovations that we see coming out are as much software artistry as they are software engineering. And I wonder how your thoughts about that have changed, and where the developer is the engineer and where they're the artist, and how you reconcile that as we move forward into some very different technologies.
Actually, my attitude hasn't changed at all, that ultimately delivering systems of economic value is always an engineering process. It requires different degrees of looseness and tightness in the ceremony of how one does that, depending upon the forces upon you. But the way I envision it is, every project is a project that must reasonably, optimally push back the forces against it. Time, cost, whatever, these kinds of things. And when I'm starting small, as we see in many of the startups, You don't need that level of engineering because the risk profile is so fundamentally different. The risk profile then is, can I even build something that does a modicum of what we're doing? At the point in time then that you've gotten through the fundamental issues of risk, do I know the basic architecture to how to do this? You've gone through those prototypes. Now then you have to start attending to the engineering issues. It's also more difficult, as you and I know, that if I'm dealing with a situation where I have absolutely no legacy, then that's a very different engineering problem than if I am indeed constrained by legacy. So a lot of the innovation that we're seeing, they have full running ground because they don't have to worry about a previous installed base. And they can do most anything. The forces are different for them than for someone who has that kind of legacy.
So I have a slightly different take on this, although not inconsistent. I would say that every great engineer is an artist.
Well said.
Every great artist is an engineer. It's the ones who are not great where you see the divide. Because a great engineer understands that they're building something beautiful as well as something functional. And in fact, that's one of the tests that it's right. And a great artist actually has done the work so that they can make it appear simple. And I remember, you look at modern art, for example, and you think, people used to laugh when it was, sort of, not quite accepted. It's like, I could do that. It looks like something that, my 4-year-old drew. But you go back and you look at what someone like Picasso could do. When he was a young man, he was he had all of the skills of any of the previous, generations of, representational artists. And then he took it in a new direction. And you look at the work of a great poet, they know what they're doing. It's not just, so there's this sort of idea that artists and engineers are coming from different planets, and I think they're really at the pinnacle of both professions. They overlap, incredibly well.
Buckminster Fuller said something to the effect that he doesn't think about beauty when he's designing something, but he knows when he's done, if it's beautiful, then it was right.
Yeah.
So, I think that we have over-rotated on assuming that perhaps the man-machine interface will allow us to do engineering, and that doesn't. Code gen is a good example. It's not always, that does not generate necessarily artifacts that would suit Tim's test. I do think that it's important that we do appreciate that artists and craftsmen, or that engineers are, we need to treat them like that. And I think that sometimes we don't. And that's one of the important, certainly from a Redmond perspective, we do think it's important that it is understood that these engineers actually should be allowed to express their craft and should be, treated accordingly. They are not cogs in a machine. They are not necessarily somebody that will always work most effectively from 9 to 5. We use the shorthand, we talk about developers' hours. And I think it's just important that if organizations want to be more effective, they need to support the craftspeople in their organization to be artists and engineers.
One more question?
This might be seen as a more philosophical question. You've touched on such things as almost a movement back to the tribal behaviors or tribal information. One of the technologies that disrupted that closed community of knowledge was, of course, the printed word, and much more of a dispersal of scientific information. What we're seeing today with crowdsourcing and with all of the internet idea memes and this much more tribal thought is much more of an embrace of superstition and an anti-scientific attitude, even amongst people using the technologies. How do you imagine that could be prevented?
Hopefully,
Eventually,
people watch his show, and they will realize.
Well, the long-term answer is eventually those people who are superstitious will die. So we'll have a new generation. Generation or so before, people didn't trust banks because they couldn't.
Now they don't trust them again.
That's right.
They were right.
I trust the banks. It's the bankers I don't necessarily trust. Good point. You know, I am optimistic in the sense that the human spirit has found a way to adapt and endure through so many changes. So I'm optimistic that we'll find the way. I can't tell you what that way is, but I believe we will find that way. You put this in the same areas as superstition. I'm trying to ponder if I agree with that or not.
I think Arthur C. Clarke, I mean, I don't know about
Yeah.
superstition, but, you know, as he said, any technology sufficiently advanced is indistinguishable from magic. I think that's one of my concerns,
Yeah.
that we do get so far away from understanding how things are built
Yeah.
that we can't make good decisions. I do think it's important that we don't imagine that all of this stuff is delivered by kind of angels that just come and magically make stuff happen. I think it's important that we are cognizant.
How do you know which ideas not good if there's not a shared, it used to be the scientific method was all around. That was always over time. What is the substitute, that kind of discernment?
Yeah. We know even now this.
Stupidity
Yeah.
seems to be the substitute.
We know that the scientific method is under
Attack.
pressure, under attack from lots of places. It truly is. So the great thing about the scientific method is that, you know, truth does advance, although there are forces that try to dumb it down along the way.
Openness,
Yeah.
evidence-based decision making.
Transparency,
We have to
a
keep
balance of
fighting.
power. Yeah, it's the market decides. We decide. Humanity decides. It's a long journey. I don't have any good answers other than, you know, you have to participate in it. I think as technologists, one of our responsibilities is we are not just building technology. It goes back to your point that you quoted me earlier. We are doing things that change the world, and there is a responsibility that each of us has to decide, is that what we really want to do? There are projects I have walked away from because I did not agree with some, you know, philosophical issue of what they were doing. This is wrong. This is wrong for society. And I walked away from those kinds of things. You have that right too. You also have, I think, the responsibility to educate the non-technical people around you that there are implications for the kinds of things you do. So you need to participate in that dialogue.
So at Red Monk, I mean, for what it's worth, we do some things like we disclose all of our clients. Not all analyst firms do that. We think it's important that people can understand potential conflicts of interest. And if it's unfortunate, but sometimes we have to. You talk about walking away from projects. We sometimes have to walk away from money, and that's quite hard because money is quite nice. But yeah, we have companies in the industry that we cannot do business with because they are not prepared to allow us to disclose that they will become a client. It's tough, but you have to show some backbone and make moral decisions, I think. Not everybody does that, but I do, and I would hope that you guys do, and we should show leadership with our decision making.
It's expressed many years ago at one of my conferences by Clay Shirky. He told a story, probably apocryphal, of how Thomas Watson once said that he saw no need for more than 4 or 5 computers in the world, and Clay said we now know that he overstated the number by 4. That there's really only one big computer. But what we used to call a computer, as in a standalone computer, whether it's the mainframe era or a cell phone, is clearly not the unit of interest anymore. So I think it's both. It is the mainframe era again, except the mainframe is the sum total of all computers as they are connected. Even something like Watson, as centralized as it is, I was just mentioning earlier, it's got to read all those documents. Where are they coming from? Well, they're coming from other computers. It's not like they were all loaded into that one, machine, on paper tape. They kind of were pulled in from the network, and that's an ongoing process. Google, for its network of servers, is basically just a node in that global network from which it's sucking in content on a constant basis. I mean, almost everything we do today is really, it's both a network and a computer. And
It's a dessert topping and the Horlicks.
yeah, that's right.
People are, no Saturday Night Live fans here. What is this?
Yeah.
But that's right. What else with you guys?
So one of the
Watson runs on power.
Yeah.
You can use it anyway.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, well, no,
No, it was mainframe as concept. Okay.
Yeah,
Not as.
I think we're in a world made of messages. I think sometimes we focus too much on the repositories and the data stores. This world that Tim is, I mean, we can look at it either way. Both are valid, but I think this world that Tim is describing, I think, it's the messages and the pointers to all of this information, which is kind of where the value is. There cannot be one. I mean, there isn't one single thing. It is a distributed environment, but of course there are these central computers as well. I think the key is that it's about integration of all of the different data. That's what's interesting. That's SOA. That's the internet, and we're lucky to have all these wonderful tools at our disposal that we can create this thing.
Yeah, and I have to say, integration is one of the things I believe that IBM is all about, and I think that's a lot of that integration is still ahead of us.
Yeah, Herbert Simon notes that at some level of abstraction, every system is a message passing system, be it organic or social or computerized, and there will always be nodes within that system that are more powerful than others. That's just the nature of how things evolve.